Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we've got a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about the Black Knight from Marvel Comics, Shining Knight from DC Comics, Morgan le Fae, who appears in Marvel and DC, and of course, Arthurian legend, the SDF-1 from the Robotech franchise, the Loc-Nar, and the Taarakians from the Heavy Metal franchise, just all sorts of stuff. But before we get into all of that, we would love it if you were to smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love to hear from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. Okay, so that said, the prologue to this one is really just the last few game sessions. Um, in a nutshell, super quick, a supervillain named the Shaper of Worlds basically deleted the world's governments and their property. So now there's no emergency services like fire trucks, ambulances, sewer pipes. It's a mess, right? And ever since that happened, the player characters have been struggling to solve all of these problems, right? And in the last game, the player characters decided to summon a character named Brainiac 14. I'm not going to explain her in great detail. There's some videos about that. One of them should be pretty clearly labeled. So if you don't know who that is, watch that video first. But at any rate, they summoned her, and my wife was playing Morgan le Fae, and she used a power called personality transfer to take control, right? So she was in the driver's seat, not only of Brainiac 14, but also of every single nanoscopic robot that Brainiac 14 owned, which those are called Nanites. And so the idea was they went to Japan first to this thing called the SDF-1. For those that don't know, the SDF-1 is a gigantic starship which crashed near Japan. I think the name of the island is South Ataria Island. Um, at any rate, it's very close to Japan there. This ship crashed into that in the year 1999. And it basically took them 10 years to fix it and get it up and going again. And as soon as they did, when they activated that ship, it attracted this group of aliens called the Zentradi. So they showed up on Earth, and there was a very brief war, right? And at the end of the war between the Zentradi and Earth, that ship, the SDF-1, was broken again. Uh, it was stuck in the robot mode, so it's basically standing waist deep in the water off the coast of Japan there, right? And it's been there the whole time. So we also ran this adventure. I'm going to be real quick about it, where some more Robotech characters from the future had come back in time for story reasons that I'm not going to get into at the moment. And they left some motorcycles behind that were called Cyclone riders, right? Um, so the first thing that Morgan le Fae did was use nanites on a Cyclone rider, which also has the ability to transform, by the way, like in the Transformers franchise. It turns into, like, imagine if you wore Iron Man armor. I'm making this very simplistic, but kind of think of how like Iron Man wears a suit of armor, but then the Hulk Buster armor is like a bigger, tougher suit then that goes over top of the first suit of armor. You know what I mean? How he's kind of like a Russian nesting doll in a way, right? That's how Cyclone riders work. Is the base armor you wear is called ride armor, and then the motorcycle itself transforms into the bigger, bulkier armor that you wear over that first thing of armor, right? At any rate, the thought process here is they wanted to use the nanites on one of these bikes first, so to see if the bike would like turn itself on and like attack them, and Brainiac stuff basically. And so they tried it out and it didn't happen because there was some speculation last game about how much control the PCs actually had over this technology they were using, right? They felt like they were kind of playing with fire. So that goes okay. So then after that, they do it to the SDF-1, to the entire starship. And what the nanites do, by the way, is they basically eat existing matter and then replace it. And then the configuration they choose is an upgrade. So everything that they assimilate turns into an upgraded version of itself, as long as it's a man-made object, right? Or alien-made in the case of the SDF-1. What I mean there is just it does nothing to like say organic matter. So it does nothing to say the water there in the ocean where the thing is sitting, right? It only converts the ship. So when that goes well, and now the SDF-1 is upgraded and repaired and so on and so forth, they sort of unleash this stuff on the rest of the world. So it assimilates Tokyo first, turning it into Neo Tokyo, right? Which we've seen in a bunch of anime. And then that will also kind of give you an idea of what you should be imagining in terms of the aesthetic. You know what I mean? Futuristic buildings, futuristic cars. You get the idea, right? And so then, of course, there are cables on the ocean floor that connect the continents. So the nanites upgrade the cable and they go to California. And so it starts in the west coast of the United States. And we mentioned that, for instance, we had a game not so awful long ago about the West Coast Avengers, and there was a Marvel villain named Arcade. And he had this twisted theme park called Murder World. And so we've mentioned that in several adventures now. So in this one, we see Murder World get upgraded, right? And one of the things that Murder World was famous for is that it has machinery there that can create a robotic duplicate that is a perfect replica of a famous character. And it can be heroes or villains. Usually they look like they looked back in the day. It's the classic version of the characters. But we've had a lot of games about that. So all of that stuff now is upgraded by these nanites. And so the computer system that runs Murder World, it is upgraded. But in addition to that, a holographic avatar appears of Morgan le Fae, since it's her mind in all of this stuff. And I guess the thing I would liken that to is in Marvel Comics, for instance, Ultron had the memory engrams of his creator, who, by the way, was in the comics Ant-Man. In the movies, it's Iron Man, but in the comics, it was Ant-Man. He created a female robotic character named Jocasta. She had the mind of Wasp. We see that a lot. The Vision has the mind of Wonder Man, right? So hopefully that makes sense to you guys when I'm talking about that. So that the new computer in Murder World has the personality, or whatever you want to call it, of Morgan le Fae, right? And so when there's a hologram that appears, that you would talk to that to, like, say computer scan for intruders or whatever, you would be talking to a hologram of Morgan le Fae. And that would be the same worldwide. No matter where you go, if there's a computer, like that, that's kind of the setup now, right? So this stuff keeps moving eastward. And we've spent a lot of time in our game talking about this place called Mansfield, Ohio. And Mansfield, Ohio, gets mentioned actually by another role-playing game system. There was a company, I think they're still around, called Palladium, and they put out several games over the years. One, by the way, is the Robotech game, which is where we get stats for things like the SDF-1 and the Cyclone Riders and all that. But another famous game that they made is called Rifts. And Rifts has had a bunch of books over the years, and sometimes it contradicts itself. They'll come up with retcons where in some of the later books they'll say something that is not what they said initially. But one of the earliest versions of that actually they introduced this evil organization called the Federation of Magic. And interestingly enough, they say that Mansfield, Ohio is this place where a bunch of ley lines cross, right? And these are kind of like walls of mystical energy. And they pass through things on Earth, like, say, Stonehenge and the pyramids and stuff like that. And so if you start to connect the dots, because they basically say it's a natural phenomenon, right? And then oftentimes, like for instance, if those walls were already there in Egypt, then whoever the magic users were of the time or whatever, when they go to build pyramids, that's the spot they use to build them at because it's a crossroads, right? Hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I'm not doing a very good job of explaining things today. But point being, so according to Riffs, which is like they really push the ley line stuff, they say that Mansfield, Ohio, for whatever reason, is this huge junction. So Mansfield, Ohio is famous for this old reformatory. The Mansfield Reformatory is thought by a lot of people in real life actually to be like very, very haunted. So because of the ley line thing, then in our game, we took liberties with the entire concept. And we said, not only is that true, it's like ridiculously true that it is like a paranormal hotspot, big time, right? And so we came up with the idea that when they were building that reformatory, um, they, how do we want to put this? Like they were building it out of weird materials. Like think of Ghostbusters for a minute, the first Ghostbusters movie from 1984. When they're talking about how, I believe the character's name is Evo Chandler, when he was building the apartment building where Dana Barrett lives, he was building it out of really bizarre materials. They mentioned at one point selenium girders, right? Um, Venkman has this line where he's like, I guess they don't make them like they used to. And it's Ray or Egon, somebody says they never made it like this, you know? We kind of say that about the reformatory, that they build it out of weird stuff, and that like the inner wall is stone, the outer wall is stone, but between those two is a weird layer of exotic materials covered in these occult runes and evil symbols and stuff like that. And so when the superheroes found out about this in an old game, at first they mistakenly thought that whoever built this place was trying to keep out evil spirits. It turns out they were trying to contain them. So the reformatory was basically a huge ghost trap, right? And so the thing that this evil cult was doing, they were really into human sacrifice, right? Because again, we're going to mention the Palladium role-playing game. In that system, they talk about something called PPE, which stands for potential psychic energy. And depending on who you ask, PPE might be kind of their code word for like the human soul. And then there's a bunch of stuff in Rifts that can use PPE as an energy source, right? And that includes magic users. If they want to cast a spell, they need to have access to PPE to do it, right? So we said that this evil organization built this place not because they cared about justice, not because, and again, we're taking liberties. I'm not throwing shade at whoever built that place in real life. It's a role-playing game. This is what you do with role-playing games, right? But at any rate, we said that whoever that was, they didn't care about reforming people or making society better or any of that. All they cared about was power, right? And so their idea was this was the one place where they were allowed to execute people. And so everybody would just give them criminals and they would, behead them. And we said they had a sub basement that was kind of this thing nobody knew about that was like a dungeon underneath it all with a huge drain. And so they were executing prisoners down there, and the blood was going down that drain. And every time they did that to somebody, they were trying to contain that PPE, right? For their own sinister purposes. Um, that blood that went down the drain then acted kind of like roots, and that was growing under the city. Okay. And we got that idea, we got the visual for that from the TV show Stranger Things, where there's a lot of weird roots and stuff associated with the Demogorgon, and you know what I mean? So we were going for some of those visuals back when Stranger Things first hit and was like really, really hot, super, super popular in pop culture circles. Okay, so the other thing, and this is going to sound unrelated, but totally is related. The other thing that we said in the game was so Necron, Lord of the Unliving, for some reason, went to Mansfield, Ohio on Friday the 13th of September, 1991. He got in a famous fight with three local superheroes, one of whom was Powerhouse, right? The other two were Shadowstorm and Torch. At any rate, it was a mystery why he was here, right? Why show up in the middle of nowhere? What's the point? The kids, the three boys had no idea about ley lines or this evil cult at this prison or anything, right? They were completely in the dark about all of that. Well, they defeated Necron. He had actually, right before that, he had had a battle with Arthur, and he was very weak when he faced those boys. So they were able to beat him. And then after that, for a while, he was like a disembodied spirit. And in our game world, we have sentinels, just like the kind you see in X-Men 97, right? Kind of two-tone purple robots, very, very tall. They like to hunt mutants. So we said in our game world that even kind of in the middle of nowhere, most police departments have a sentinel, or most cities have at least one sentinel. So he started off by possessing the nearest one, and then he sent it to the local mall. And that was another mystery. Why do it? At first, the boys thought that the reason he was doing it was because they were there. They just thought it was an ordinary sentinel hunting them because they had superpowers, even though they weren't all mutants. Again, they were very much in the dark back then. So after that, though, he would sort of float, his disembodied spirit would go to wherever the nearest one was, take possession of that one, and send it to that mall. And it got to be where that was happening when the boys were not there. They would hear it over police band radio and head to the mall when an attack was already underway. And the sentinels would land in the parking lot, walk through the big glass front of the mall, which, by the way, we totally ripped that off from the very first episode of the 90s X-Men animated series called Night of the Sentinels. We just loved that episode. We kept doing it over and over again. But at any rate, they would bust through the glass, walk into the mall, and they were going to center court. And then they were digging. And the mall is shaped like a giant X, by the way, if you were looking down on it from above. So it was kind of this X marks the spot kind of a joke. But the question was, why are they digging? Well, so it turns out before the mall was built in 1969, there was a meteorite struck that spot. And we said that that meteorite was the Loc-Nar from the heavy metal franchise. And I can't remember if they mention it in the movie. By the way, for those that don't know, Heavy Metal was an R-rated animated movie. It came out in like 1980 or 1981, something like that. I like it, but it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. It's certainly not kid friendly. Don't watch it with kids around. Um, but point being, I can't remember if it's in the movie that they say that the Loc-Nar is the embodiment of all evil, or maybe it's an issue of Heavy Metal magazine where they say that. But the point is, that was our understanding. And in DC Comics, they have almost the exact same concept, and it's the Starheart. And they say that the Starheart is the embodiment of all evil, chaos, and magic, right? And so we thought that was a really good fit for us to say these are actually the same thing. And in Heavy Metal, the movie, we see that the Loc-Nar has the ability to travel through time and space at will. It can be wherever it wants, whenever it wants, really, you know. And by the way, for anyone who is going to be confused of like, hold on, so the Loc-Nar was buried here under the mall while uh Alan Scott had the Starheart? Like, what's up with that? Think of it like this. Hopefully everybody's seen the Back to the Future movies, right? There are moments in those movies where there are two Martys in on the same date coexisting, right? At the end of the first movie, one Marty is getting ready to go to 1955 while another one comes running up and looks down into the parking lot and he just got back from 1955. And that one can see his younger self, right? Likewise, in Back to the Future 2, once again, we get two Martys, right? One's on stage playing Johnny Be Good. The other one's in the rafters wearing a black leather jacket, right? So hopefully we're all on the same page there. You can have two Loc-Nars in the same place on the same date because the Loc-Nar has sorcery and it can just substitute sorcery for time travel, right? If that's confusing for anybody, that's okay. Just say something in the comments section and I'll try to do a better job of explaining it. But okay, so we said that there was a Loc-Nar that struck this spot, that it was attracted to this area because of all that ley line stuff. Because again, we say it's the embodiment of all evil, magic, and chaos, right? So if it's the embodiment of magic and ley lines are made of magic, and there's a cult here doing magic stuff, right? We thought, yep, this all of these puzzle pieces fit together. So it turns out Necron, who is a mystical being, I'll leave it at that, wanted to get his hands on the Loc-Nar. That's what he was having the Sentinels dig for, right? So, okay. So going back to the prison for a minute, I said that, there's blood going down the drain in their secret dungeon. It's forming these roots we refer to as blood roots. They're reaching and stretching under the city, burrowing through sewers and, stuff like that towards the mall because those roots are reaching out for the Loc-Nar. Around the year 2010, which by the way is around the general ballpark of time when our Zentradi War was over too, by the way. But at any rate, that general ballpark of time, the roots finally permeated that area. I even gave the heroes a chance to do something about it. They were at the mall and they ended up in the boiler room and they saw where roots were coming through the walls, and they were able to scan them and stuff. And they detected that these roots had human blood in them. And the heroes did nothing. They just dropped the ball. So the roots make their way to the Loc-Nar, and when they grab it, when they wrap around it, that green glow of the Loc-Nar, which the Loc-Nar is a perfectly round, glowing green orb. It can be whatever size it wants to be. Sometimes it's as small as a marble, and there's a guy, I think, named Hanover Fist, who is fidgeting with this marble, during the heavy metal movie. Other times we saw one time where it crashed into a volcano and then grew to massive proportions where it was like the size of a stadium, right? Well, so right now the Loc-Nar at this point in the story is like the size of like a bowling ball, right? It's this glowing green sphere, and the roots wrap around it, and then that green glow starts to slowly travel back those roots back to the prison where that evil cult then starts to harness energy. They are empowered by the Loc-Nar, and they're mad with power, and they are also learning from it because the Loc-Nar, by the way, is sentient and it wants bad things, right? And so it starts to put bad ideas in these guys' heads, not like they had good ideas to begin with, but you know what I mean? Worse ideas, bigger ideas. So these guys get the bright idea to go to CERN and use the Large Hadron Collider there to try to destabilize the multiverse. And we got that idea from another role-playing game called Gamma World, which came out around that time, by the way. And in Gamma World, they mention CERN by name. They say that something happened called the Big Mistake, and then it caused an infinite number of dimensions to collapse into a single dimension. And so when I first read that, I thought, oh, so, okay, so I am in Gamma World, apparently, as well as an infinite number of my variants. Like, Gamma World seems like it would be a very busy place, right? Like, the population of Gamma World would be infinity under that assumption. So then the book says, no, no, no. One of you gets to survive and live there. The others all die in the Big Mistake, which I thought was a horrific concept, right? How would you represent that mathematically? Would you say that 99.9 repeating percent of me all passed away in that moment? So think about all the PPE that would be released by the Big Mistake. That was the concept. So this evil cult is like, we're going to absorb all that energy. And, what they wanted was they wanted to be gods. And not really with like a lowercase g. They don't want to be like, I'm the god of agriculture or something, right? They wanted to be like, no, no, no. We want to create universes on a whim. We want to do whatever we want to do. We don't want to be bound by morality. They were totally selfish. So Powerhouse stopped them. At any rate, so that gives you an idea about all this stuff that's been going on, right? I know that's a lot. I apologize. It's kind of what happens when you keep playing the same role-playing game for 40 years. So I've been dangling this plot thread for decades now about the roots under the city and the Loc-Nar and the reformatory and all that stuff, right? So this adventure has been a really long time coming. Well, so here's what happens. Those nanites start coming this way, and they have no idea what's there. And they're going through concrete, they're converting matter, so on and so forth, right? They reach where the mall used to be, which is now, of course, just a vacant concrete slab. Because, like I said, Powerhouse used his gold lantern ring to remove his headquarters. By the way, he made that the headquarters because, like I said, he and his friends used to go there all the time. That's where all of their adventures basically took place. So, so at any rate, the slab there gets assimilated, and then the Nanites start working their way down until they hit Loc-Nar, right? And the Loc-Nar doesn't like that. And we mentioned recently in one of the episodes I think I did about Green Lanterns, we talked about the Starheart and how DC says the Starheart is the embodiment of all chaos, evil, and magic in the entire universe, and that they go kind of like an almost elemental route with it, where then they say that the Green Lantern rings then were supposed to represent the opposite of all that. That they, instead of chaotic, they represent order. Instead of evil, they were supposed to represent good. Um, and instead of magic, they represent technology, right? And so if you think about the nanites, they are technology, right? Um, they are orderly. I wouldn't say they're good. Um, Morgan le Fae is kind of a hard character to break down in terms of her morality, and this is already a long video, so let's just not. But you still got 2 out of 3 though, right? Um, the nanites are restoring order, which the Loc-Nar would not like. The nanites are technology, which the Loc-Nar does not like. So the Loc-Nar decides to grow. And so it busts up out of the ground. It gets huge. And remember the thing I said earlier about how sometimes it's the size of a marble and sometimes it's the size of a stadium, right? It has the growth power. It just rips up out of the ground, knocking concrete and stuff aside. Um, and what we see next is very similar to what we saw towards the end of the heavy metal movie. If I remember correctly, I haven't seen it for years actually, but if I remember correctly, it goes into a volcano, turns the lava green. Um, the energy from the Loc-Nar mutates a bunch of the people in the area, and their skin turns green, and they are more evil than they were before, right? And they are now the Loc-Nar's minions. So the thing with Mansfield is it's a prison town. It has the old reformatory as well as the current state prison. Um, when people get out of prison, there are a variety of programs in the community to help them find a place to live, to help them get a job, so on and so forth. All of those programs, and again, I'm not throwing that under the bus, right? I don't want to get in any arguments about stuff, but it keeps those people local, right? They don't leave. Um, it's almost like the social equivalent of a black hole. And then the other thing is, let's say someone is a gang member, and if they get sent here, oftentimes the other gang members move here so that they can visit that person, or their family does the same to visit them, right? And generations of this have been happening, right? So the people who used to live in Mansfield, a lot of them have kind of jumped ship. They don't want to be like that. And at one point, Mansfield actually had the highest murder rate per population in Ohio. Um, because of all this stuff, right? Um, so I don't know how to put this. When you start thinking in like Dungeons and Dragons terms about alignment, where I would argue that the purest of the pure, a pure-hearted person in kind of that fairy tale sense is lawful good, right? And then the worst of the worst, I would argue, is chaotic evil. And then in the middle is true neutral, right? That's how D&D alignment works. So what we are saying in our game, and I'm not saying in the real town, I'm saying in our game, because again, you got to take liberties for role-playing games. If you didn't, superpowers wouldn't work. Everything would be crazy boring. Okay, so that said, we said in the game, for the sake of simplicity, that basically the lawful good people have left, right? There's some neutral good people left over. And by the way, when they see all this happening on this particular date, they're going to leave, right? point being, the idea of what we said the Loc-Nar does is all of the people in town get to basically make a saving throw that is influenced by your alignment. So if your alignment is that you are true neutral, you get a +0 to your roll, right? It doesn't affect it one way or another. It's just a straight roll. If you're lawful good, we're going to give you some sort of a bonus to help you make that roll, right? But if you're chaotic evil, you're going to get penalties to your roll that makes it hard to succeed. And for those guys, they are the ones that the Loc-Nar mutates and their skin turns green and they are now its minions, right? And I don't want to call them zombies because they're not really zombies. A lot of people on game day were kind of referring to them as such. I don't think that's what they are. I think they're mutants or mutates is, I guess, what Marvel would call them. Mutant being you're born with this thing that just is inevitably going to kick in upon reaching puberty. A mutate would be more like Spider-Man, where something happened to him to give him powers. So I would say these are mutates. But at any rate, you get the gist. The Loc-Nar gets huge. These guys are everywhere. So that's when the player characters show up. So Black Knight and Shining Knight do what knights do, right? And to me, this seemed very on brand for that scene at the end of the Heavy Metal movie. So they start fighting guys at ground level, right? So we have a Taarakian, which is this race. They are like the heroic arch enemies of the Loc-Nar. But also, we are told in the Heavy Metal franchise that Taarakians die. They are by no means immune to the Loc-Nar or whatever, you know. And anytime one of them dies, and basically, um, I would almost think of it like the Speed Force from DC, right? Um, when one of them dies, somebody else becomes like the chosen one, and then their hair turns white, and they get this tattoo on the side of their neck that to me kind of looks like a red dagger. And then usually they wear a black sort of collar thing around their neck to keep you from seeing the dagger tattoo thing. But the point is, there used to be many, and now there is one at a time. And so when one dies, somebody else arises and becomes the next Taarakian. So here then, at the beginning of the game, we have a Taarakian show up and dies, right? So we set that up. And then Morgan le Fae shows up and her hair turns white. So we're saying, she's the one who needs to deal with the Loc-Nar now. And she was trying to figure out how to do that. My wife was worried, and this was a very similar worry rather, to when she was playing Rogue recently. And she was worried about punching people and ripping through her gloves and absorbing unwanted traits from supervillains, right? Same idea here, right? If the Loc-Nar can turn people green, she was worried that if she goes up to it and does something to it, it's going to turn her green and she's going to be bad. And this is her favorite character to play, actually. This is kind of like if she were running a game, this would be her GMPC. So she doesn't really want anything bad happening to her. So she came up with a very interesting solution, which is she goes back to the SDF-1, she takes it overhead, and it is high enough that the energy of the Loc-Nar is not hurting it any. And at all of kind of like the battle stations on the bridge of the SDF-1 is one of these hard light holographic avatars of Morgan le Fae, right? There's a bunch of Morgan le Faes all over the place, all over the ship, I mean. And so they do what you got to do to ready the main gun. And so that takes 10 minutes, according to Palladium's Robotech RPG. and a round is 4 seconds long. So that is an eternity in game time. So we had plenty of time for mindless hack and slash on the ground, which is what players have been wanting for a little while. And these mutates are just kind of rando dudes, who are, gang members and stuff like that. They're not Batman or they're not Captain America level guys in terms of combat. So, Shining Knight and Black Knight are up there with like Batman and Captain America and stuff like that. So they are taking care of business. Um, and then what's his face shows up? I can't believe I forgot his name. Percival. Percival shows up, and he is the same race as the Owens, right? So he's this little guy with blue skin and like long mustache, and he wears glowing green armor. And he is not the Percival of Arthurian legend. That Percival was actually named after this Percival. But this Percival was uh, running around back when King Arthur was king of Camelot and all that stuff. He's super, super old, like like the Owens. The Owens are all immortals that have been around for a zillion years. So Percival shows up because, like I said, we said the Loc-Nar is the Starheart, and the Starheart is the antithesis to a Green Lantern ring, right? So the detect power of his Green Lantern ring alerted him to like, hey, something bad is happening over there. So as he sees this thing getting ready to fire, he uses his force manipulation to put Black Knight and Shining Knight into a force bubble, and he flies to safety, right? And and so now the only people here are are the bad guys, right? The good, like I said earlier, the good guys left. They are at a safe distance. So the SDF-1 finally fires. And in the Robotech RPG, it is, to the best of my knowledge, the only time where instead of telling you how many dice to roll for damage, it says you don't roll damage with the main gun. It says it destroys everything in its path. And it writes the word everything in all caps, right? I haven't seen that anywhere else in Palladium. But so then it says that the beam is 2 miles wide and 60,000 miles long, right? I don't have it in front of me right now, but the Earth is only a few thousand miles wide. I want to say 8,000, something like that. So that means there'd be 52,000 miles of beam coming out the other side of the Earth, continuing out through space. I was feeling charitable as the GM, and I said there were no friendly ships or space shuttles or space stations over there. I did say they took out a bunch of satellites, though. But the beam coming out the other side of the Earth comes out of the Indian Ocean, halfway between the southern tip of Africa and the westernmost tip of Australia, right? So, and then we've also said, because again, we have DC and Marvel stuff in our game, DC Comics classically has this thing called Skartaris, right? Which is the Hollow Earth. There were these old comic books called Warlord, about a character named Warlord. His secret identity was Travis Morgan, who found his way into the Hollow Earth, and it's full of fantasy stuff, right? There's all sorts of weird stuff down there, dinosaurs, and it has like flying saucers and stuff like that too. So there's kind of that juxtaposition of fantasy and technology, which, by the way, is very riffs. Um, but point being, so we've mentioned that before in our game world. So the world is hollow. So not only do they punch a hole in the Indian Ocean, they they blow a hole through Skartaris, right? Where it's the entry point of the laser. It goes right through the sun of Skartaris, which would be the Earth's core. Bullseye shot there. goes out the other side, which puts a second hole in Skartaris, and then out through the Indian Ocean. That's the exit. What would you call it? Not exit wound, but you know what I mean, right? So then we said the Hollow Earth starts to flood with water. Um, and I was like, holy cow. And then the air pressure inside of Skartaris means that this hole in Mansfield, which is now, by the way, the one side of that giant chasm is where the mall used to be, right? The other side is where the prison used to be. Between the two is the roots, because my wife, who's been playing the game forever and a day, wanted to nuke the roots, right? She wanted to finally be done with all of that stuff. So at any rate, there's this just crazy big hole. And there was a shock wave, by the way, that, went out from ground zero there. So, like, there really isn't a Mansfield, Ohio anymore, right? Um, and now coming out of that hole, just straight up in the air, is like wind, because again, the water that rushes in the one side is forcing the air out the other side, right? So, so this became now the new big problem that everybody had to deal with. So Morgan le Fae goes to the other side of the world to try to patch the hole. And at first she tries to use nanites, but the force of the water rushing in, and this is epilogue now, by the way, but the force of the water rushing in was just washing the nanites away. They couldn't sort of like cling to the rock long enough to convert the rock into metal and then start to grow something to, to close the hole, so on and so forth. Percival, who I mentioned, he's the same race as the Owens. The DC Atlas for the DC RPG gives stats on the Owens, and it says they all have a willpower of 30, which is crazy, by the way. How Jordan only has a 25. So since Percival has a ring, that means he has 30 APs of force manipulation. So he goes down and he tries to basically put a big cork in that hole, right? And all he does is give it a body of 30, and that's it. But that's not enough. The force of the water going through there shreds this cork. So then Morgan le Fae is talking about, well, what if we take all of the stuff out of landfills and we like throw that in the hole, but we transmute it into some other material, yada, 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 and what they came up with was kind of like carbon. You know how like in the Superman movies, Superman can crush coal into diamond? And so the players were like, yeah, diamond's really hard. Well, diamond has a body of 15. Again, a body of 30 got shredded. So even if you compressed all of the carbon in all the world's landfills, you're still not going to get something with the level of durability you need to plug this thing, right? And the people of Skartaris are in danger. So the heroes have to act fast. And so all these different things, like they talk about, let's go out and get an asteroid. Let's put that in the hole. Percival does that. The asteroid gets shredded. It doesn't have a high enough body. They try all this various stuff. And when they're talking about the landfill thing, one of the ideas, or no, it wasn't, I'm sorry, it wasn't. They did actually talk about using boom tubes to get rid of stuff in landfills, but that was kind of different. They started talking about how at one point, because there is carbon on other planets, and if the atmospheric pressure of a planet is high enough, it can crush that into diamond, right? And then if the heat of that planet is high enough, if it's close enough to the sun, you know how all matter has the three states, right? Of solid, liquid, and gas. It can melt diamond into its liquid state. And then if it's hot enough, it can turn diamond into a gaseous state. And believe it or not, then on some planets, it rains diamond, right? So at one point, the player characters come up with the idea of let's get our hands on a boom tube, which the Justice League has. So Shining Knight and Percival would have connections to go get a boom tube from somebody like Big Barda or Mr. Miracle or whoever. And they're like, let's make a boom tube on one of these planets where it rains diamond, and then maybe it can fill the hole with diamond, right? That was the idea at the one point. And so they're like, well, that's not going to work. But then my wife, who sometimes plays Supergirl, remembered an issue of the 90s Supergirl comic. That was the Linda Danvers comic book. And her version of Supergirl one time went to the planet Apocalypse, which is where Darkseid lives. And the interesting thing is when she goes there, everybody's like the size of Galactus. She's like, what's going on? And it's this kind of forgotten thing in classic DC continuity is actually all of those characters like Darkseid and Big Barda and them, they are that big, right? But when they come to Earth, the boom tube shrinks them down to human size so that they can interact with other human characters. And then when people go to the planet Apocalypse, like if Batman goes to the planet of Apocalypse, what they used to say in the comics, and they kind of just forget about it these days, is that the boom tube actually makes Batman huge. When Batman goes to the planet Apocalypse, he's like the height of Galactus while he's there, right? Fun little bit of trivia, comic book stuff. Well, so then they realize they're like, wait a minute, um, let's get some adamantium and plug the hole. And so that's what they do. They get like an adamantium peg. Adamantium is hard to work with, but not impossible to work with. And the player characters have a lot of resources, which I've kind of outlined earlier in this adventure. So basically, they make like a sort of like a cork or a stopper, a drain plug kind of a thing out of adamantium. They send it through a boom tube, and then when it comes out, it's 2 miles wide when it comes out the other end, and then that works. They push down on that and they get it, and there's like a huge whirlpool, by the way, that's formed. So they're able to get it to go down there into the heart of the thing, and it finally stops it. So that was the biggest problem to deal with was the problem they themselves created. And I'm sure that this is not the first role-playing group to have that happen to them, but that was it. Was it for this adventure. Pretty weird one. But we liked it. Hopefully you liked hearing about it. If so, as always, we would love it if you took just a quick second of your time to support the channel by smashing that like button. Make sure you're subscribed and leave us a comment. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero role-playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.